And joining us is Alain Tolhurst, of course, political commentator. Alan, good afternoon to you.
Afternoon.
Nice to have you with us. Let's start with the 2 million people signing a petition. This has happened before. I can remember in 2011, I think it was, when David Cameron, there was a petition to unseat him. This was done on Facebook at the time, and people were absolutely sure. And it was curious. I remember, I said this in the last hour, speaking to a woman, her name was Carol. I distinctly remember the conversation. And she was telling me that I was some kind of buffoon for not understanding. She said, "Mark my words, Ian, David Cameron will not be our Prime Minister this time next week. Have you not seen how many people have signed this thing?" And it was about 100,000, I think, back then. Now, of course, it's not going to unseat a sitting Prime Minister, but what does a petition like this actually achieve, Alan?
Yeah, well, actually, that petition itself was the one that actually prompted the Parliament to bring in its own petition system, which is the one that people have been doing now. Previously, it was sort of ad hoc, whereas it was an official route. And essentially, if you get past 100,000, then you get a statement, and if it gets to like a million or 100,000, it gets a debate in Parliament, essentially. And so, yeah, this obviously is well past that. Whether that debate will take place or how long it will take for that debate to take place, I'm not too sure. But, you know, we have seen big petitions before. I think the one to revoke Article 50, the second referendum campaigners, I think they got something like 6 million people signed that. Yeah. And obviously that didn't end up with Brexit being revoked. So no, it doesn't necessarily always lead to change. But I think it's kind of interesting. I think your point at the beginning was right. You know, that an awful lot of people did not vote for this government and therefore understandably were angry anyway, and so are likely to continue to be angry. I think this is always kind of lost when even there's a big landslide, the other side still gets an awful lot of votes. People talk about Boris Johnson's landslide in 2019. You know, Jeremy Corbyn got annihilated. Well, still 12 million people voted for Labour in that election. You know, so there's an awful lot of people on the other side of it, and so understandably a lot of people who were unhappy about the prospect of a Keir Starmer government have obviously not had those fears allayed in the last few months, and therefore would like another do-over. But unfortunately, that's not how our democratic system works.
And it is always worth reminding ourselves that more people voted for Jeremy Corbyn than Keir Starmer.
Right, exactly. And in 2017, in the election before that, I think Labour got something like 40% of the vote, very nearly, obviously won. You know, and so therefore, it's an odd system we had. I think we had a very fractured election this time round, on kind of a four-way split, and actually that's going to continue to be the problem, I think, going forward for Labour is they've got lots of constituencies where they didn't get a huge percentage of the seat, percentage of the vote to win that seat, but got enough to get over the line, and that's actually what they're going to have to try and sort of protect. And this kind of anger early on shows that there's going to be perhaps maybe a more coordinated attempt to unseat them next time. I
wondered whether, you know, inside Labour HQ, Keir Starmer responded on TV this morning to this petition, saying, well, you know, it's no surprise that people who didn't vote for us would like to rerun the poll. So he made a similar point as well. But does it stick to quote Boris Johnson, does it stick a ferret up the left-wing trouser leg of Keir Starmer when something like this happens?
I don't know. I think this sort of stuff you can easily kind of brush off, especially as there is no verification for this stuff. We know that someone like Elon Musk has been amplifying that. I've seen tweets being posted by people in America giving examples of UK postcodes to be able to use them. So I don't think there's any, I think this number, very few of them actually will end up being from the UK as a proportion. And I think, you know, seeing some areas have this, you know, I think some seats where like 5 or 10% of the electorate have signed this petition. I find it very hard to believe that in the space of 48 hours, you know, more than 5% of any constituency would have signed up to this kind of petition. I think it's most likely to have not all come from the UK, and therefore I think it's kind of more easy for Keir Starmer in that instance to kind of dismiss it. I think you would need something a bit more kind of verified, a bit more closer to home to prove that there might be that kind of dip in support. Yeah,
that does always seem to be the case, regardless of what the petition is, that, you know, there is some sort of, you know, bot farm somewhere that seems to, I don't know, you know, fill out forms or do whatever it does. But either way, it's an interesting debate, and Starmer will get challenged on this every time he's interviewed over the next few days. So, and so will any other cabinet secretary. Speaking of others within the fold, assisted dying laws assisted dying law risks state offering a death as a service. According to the Justice Secretary, this is Shabana Mahmood, strongly opposes assisted dying. There seems to be a bit of I don't know whether there's a bit of a sort of behind-the-scenes cabinet decision on this one, Alan, but there's not all of them. Liz Kendall has a different view, but Wes Streeting, I mean, goodness me, he's the Health Secretary. Now, Ms Mahmood and others have come out saying not really behind this, which I think surprised a lot of people, because there was a sort of sense that Labour politicians would be very pro this.
Yeah, and I think it's an example of one of the reasons why putting this forward as a private member's bill through a backbench MP, Kim Ledbetter, rather than being a piece of government legislation, presents lots of issues. It does mean that people can speak freely and, therefore able to put their views forward. And it's often seen as like a matter of conscience. Therefore, people shouldn't be whipped along sort of party lines to be able to back a certain way. But it does mean that you've got this pretty open revolt in the cabinet. We're used to cabinet responsibility where people, agree to collective decisions within cabinet. They might sort of, leak something out the side, but they don't openly say that they disagree with the kind of the policy, and it's allowed this kind of thing to kind of take on a life of its own because it's not controlled by the government. The timetabling in Parliament, the debates, the way that it goes through, the impact assessment, the costs of it are all kind of out of government's control, and therefore that's why we're seeing these kind of pretty big splits within the party because it's not being kind of held together by the usual mechanisms that would stop, for example, the Health Secretary and the Justice Secretary, who would have kind of oversight of this policy, being able to talk out against it.
I heard a couple of sort of Labour grandees, as they like to say, speaking out saying, well, in Shabana Mahmood's case, she was speaking on behalf, I think she doesn't hide the fact that, she's got her own spiritual religious beliefs, which informs her views. And it was suggested that a lot of her constituents are also disproportionately Muslim, and they would have a similar view. So she's just reflecting that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what intrigued me about that statement was that MPs don't always reflect their constituents' views. I mean, if you had one on the death penalty, we'd probably be in a really strange place, right?
Well, yeah, and I think it's interesting that there is that kind of. It was Lord Falconer, the former Attorney General under the Blair era, who's been a very vocal campaigner for assisted dying, was saying that cabinet ministers like Shabana Mahmood and also Wes Streeting, who've got a Christian background, should kind of park that faith and look at it from kind of ethical, legal, kind of moral concerns rather than necessarily religious ones. But obviously, a lot of people come to that who bring their faith to something. Rachel Maskell, the Labour MP, who's very much against this bill. She's very upset with Lord Falconer over this. She thinks that it's kind of discriminatory to tell people not to have their religious beliefs form part of their politics, because for a lot of people it is, and so we shouldn't be sort of policing people's religious beliefs when it comes to such a kind of serious matter as this. But yeah, it's a very tricky position they found themselves in, and I think regardless whether this vote passes on Friday and moves to the next stage, whether it kind of falls away, there's going to be a big job to try and put not just Labour Party but kind of politics back together again. Because obviously it's become, what was meant to be quite a kind of a debate in the right spirit has become pretty fractured as it gets towards that vote on Friday. Absolutely.
And finally, this one, Alan. Labour government putting national security at risk. This is according to the former head of MI6. You'd like to think that Sir Richard Dearlove knows his way around a security issue, given his previous job. He's accusing the UK government of putting national security in a difficult place, criticising in particular Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, calling her clueless over the arrest warrant for the Israeli MP Benjamin Netanyahu. He expressed concerns over the lack of urgency in the government's response to the international security crisis, citing the Ukraine war. He obviously doesn't like the Labour Party very much, I'm guessing.
No, certainly not. And yeah, certainly that ICC arrest warrant does put the UK in a very difficult position, being a kind of responsive to a court that we are very much a firm part of, but also the fact that Israel is a key ally as well. It's a very difficult position for the government to find themselves in, and actually it plays into a kind of a wider issue, which is that this government came in promising to fix an awful lot of domestic issues. There's a huge amount of things in their in tray, but actually there is an awful lot of things on the global stage that the government is being having to do. Keir Starmer's obviously been off on his travels around the world a lot in the first few months because there's an awful lot to try and get their teeth into, not just Ukraine, obviously the Israel-Gaza, an awful lot of other stuff to try and tackle with as well. And so therefore, it's often the way that a government that tries to have a big domestic agenda, it can often get derailed by these big global events, and that's why I think someone like Yvette Cooper, Home Secretary, and David Lammy as Foreign Secretary, kind of two ministers who actually have previous government experience, have been put into those roles. I think because they know how difficult it's going to be to kind of navigate these first few months.
Yeah. It's a fair point. Alan, thank you very much indeed. Alain Tolhurst, political commentator, with us here on the programme.